Welcome to lecture number 2. This is probably going to get tiresome quickly, but let's do our ritual. Find your electronic device, turn it off, stow it. I hope all of you have been having conversations in your sections about the reasons for our electronic sort of fundamentalism, but we'll do that. You all should have a new sheet that Mr. Malkika sent out, the fall 2014 FYE events. Anybody still need that? Couple down here. All right, we'll get them too. Okay. Okay. So a couple, just a few things to note for right now. There is a round table today. It's not in the Cooperage again. It's in Student Center, room 2082 at 4 p.m. Dr. Ayala will be answering your questions, moving forward from whatever he offers you today. Any other, Danielle, any other specific things you want to note right now?
Just make sure for everybody to go buy your tickets for the 3 field trips. And it's literally first come, first serve.
Right, at the Student Center. And you go to the Student Center, that main front desk is right there, right? You just go in, right to your left, as you walk in the front door. So, roundtable, I'll be there 4 p.m. And today, Student Center. Wanted to do just a little bit, I promised you last time we would do just a little bit of celebration of our separate sections. Here's your seating chart. That's where you will be for the rest of the term, or the rest of the year, actually. So I just wanted to make sure that you all know, have seen the faces of your leaders. So I would like to ask the faculty and peer mentor to stand up when I call your name. Section 1, woo, Margaret Anderson. Section 2, President Daniel Malkika, Emily Hill. Section 3, Kiara, it's actually Tim Wandling and Jessica Shuby. Nursing. Section 4, Denny Bosman Moss. Allie Wilson. Where's Allie? There she is. Section 5, Dr. Boaz is not here today. He's away at the conference. Section 5. And Katie Hoyt's not up. There she is, right there. Section 6, Tom Shaw. With Ricky. As he likes to go by, Rihanna. Section 7, Ed Bebout. With Becca Zorinsky. Section 8, Karen Grady. With Shannon Cosgrave. There she is over there. And finally, Section 9, with Nadia Reineke. There she is. All right. So, that's you all. And, well, enjoy yourselves, enjoy the community, enjoy yourselves in the second. Yes, Dr. Mohammed.
God, I don't want to change anything for this week, but could we ask the groups that are in the middle of the room to maybe leave the last 2 seats over there open? It's like there's no room for our section.
Let's do a little bit of talk about this.
So, they're smaller over there.
Explain to me exactly what we need to do, right? So, a couple of seats in here, right here, kind of all the way down here. So, Dr. Boaz's section, Dr. Boaz's section, and Dr. Grady's section, Dr. Shaw's section, kind of squeezing over. Is that correct? Is that right? All right. So, a few seats on either side is reserved for Dr. Ayala's section, Dr. Long's section, Dr. Weebrett's section, and Dr. Block's section. All right. Anything else? Yes.
Just one thing, if you're sitting in a left-handed seat and you're not left-handed, please give it up because there are left-handed people who need that seat.
That would be an act of generosity. Those of you who have left-handed seats, raise your hands right now. Okay, one down there, one there, one here. You seem to be all the way up down the road here. There's one. Okay, excellent. So that's where they are. Any other announcements from faculty or anybody else? All right. Today we are extremely fortunate to have Dr. Emiliano Ayala speaking to us, continuing our conversation about identity and education. continuing from the remarks we heard from Dr. Kornfeld last week. And I think the purpose of this is to continue to offer to you, for us to continue to offer to you the help that we can to help you understand what exactly, how can you identify yourself, create your identity as a college student. And I believe what Dr. Ayala is going to talk about is the compassionate work you can do with yourself to understand the kind of learner you are. Is that right? Excellent. Dr. Ayala has worked for several years here at Sonoma State University and other institutions in the CSU and out of the CSU. He received his PhD from Claremont Graduate University. He is a CSU alum because I believe you have your master's degree from San Diego State. Is that correct? He's a major national leader in the areas of accessibility in education, meaning all the things that we as teachers can do to make certain that as many students with as many diverse learning abilities and styles as possible access what we have to offer them. I personally have benefited several times from his incredibly erudite and helpful work, being in workshops and so forth, to teach me how to be a better professor by making all of my materials accessible as widely and broadly as possible. Will you please offer a big, warm, generous pep welcome?
Thank you, Scott. Can everyone hear me okay? In the back? Thumbs up? So what I'm hoping to do with the 40 minutes that we have remaining, as Scott mentioned, is kind of carry over the conversation that we started last Wednesday with regard to thinking about education. And so what I hope to do today is just delve a little deeper into that idea of thinking about education and kind of trying to capture as best we can the concepts of teaching and learning in higher education. As Scott mentioned, I'm a faculty member with the School of Education, so my primary responsibility is to prepare future teachers to teach K-12 students. Many of you obviously, all of you obviously just graduated from that. My own particular area of focus is in working with students with disabilities. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about how we teach and how we learn, and in particular, this idea of learning preferences, learning challenges, and what I'll talk about a little bit later, learning realities. So hopefully you recognize, can everyone see that okay? I know it's not, I'd like to have the front lights dim, but we can't get that done. So we'll navigate through that together. Alice in Wonderland. And so what I want for us to begin thinking about is this idea of diving into the whole, the mysterious whole of what teaching and learning is all about in higher education. And you'll see I'll have multiple references to that as we kind of move through. So what do I hope to achieve? First of all, kind of framing this idea of what is teaching and learning. What are we talking about when we talk about teaching and learning, especially in higher education? We'll then focus, dive a little bit deeper into the rabbit hole, and I will share with you a little bit about how we teach or how we approach teaching in higher education. We'll dive even further, deeper into thinking about, so if we're thinking about teaching, how does that impact your learning? Obviously the two are quite connected. Then we'll spend the latter part talking about this idea of learning preferences or learning realities, and then I will end with some reflection questions that, again, as Scott mentioned, will carry forward into the roundtable, and so I hope that you're able to join us. So let's take the first step and dive into the rabbit hole. Again, we're going to start with what do we mean when we mean teaching? Keep in mind that we've been thinking about this idea of teaching for a long, long time. So on the left-hand side here, it might be difficult to see, I'll sort of narrate the pictures as we move through them, is a Mayan pictograph. And here we have somebody who we think is some kind of teacher, and his or her hands are up, and there seems to be knowledge sort of transmitting or falling down on this person who is a learner. So even in very ancient times, we as people, we as humanity have been thinking about how do we get these ideas to other people. In the middle here you have the Guru Shisha tradition of India, a very sacred, a very important way that teaching occurs within the Indian tradition. Guru meaning teacher, Shisha meaning disciple or pupil. it's a whole history. We could have lectures on each of these different topics here, but the basic idea here is that it's a very important relationship that the teacher and the student has as we think about transmitting knowledge in some fashion. Any guesses here? I wrote it for you. Socrates, right? So we talked a little bit about Socrates and the idea here he is sitting at the marketplace, kind of getting in this exchange of ideas, sharing and using questioning as a way to help teaching, right? Transmitting knowledge, if that's one of the ways that we want to characterize what teaching is. And then on the right-hand side here, Thoth, who is the ancient Egyptian, supposedly the inventor of writing and science and knowledge. So he is the deity that expresses the idea of teaching within the Egyptian philosophy or belief. And this might be difficult to see, but again, that's a cave painting. That's a cave painting. And that's the first thing I want for you to think about is, with a partner, very quickly, in 30 seconds, what was the point of cave painting? Find somebody and ask that question and answer that question. Go. Go. 10 seconds. Keep going. 10 seconds. 9, 8. 3, 2, 1. Okay, bring it together. I just want to hear from some people. Raise your hand. Yes, right in front. Okay. 2 things she mentioned. I'll repeat it back to you because perhaps you didn't hear. Pass stories down from one generation to another, or perhaps teach something like hunting. Okay? Somebody else. One more. Oh, don't be shy, Way. I know you're not. One more. Right in front.
To record the history?
To record the history. To record the history. So even back in the days that we were thinking about, right, passing on this idea of traditions and stories and knowledge, or sharing what we have learned, cave painting was a form of teaching. So again, we've been thinking about this idea of teaching and learning for many, many years. Let me start with the outer part of the circle as we're sort of falling into this hole here, and think about what we mean when we think about teaching and learning. So let's start with what is teaching, right? We've already heard a little bit from you and perhaps in your dialogues that perhaps teaching is this idea of exchanging ideas, right? Passing on or promoting ideas, or the passing of knowledge, right? How to hunt, how to do whatever we want to do. We heard a little bit from Dr. Kornfeld last Wednesday about the promotion of new knowledge, right? So is teaching about us getting you to do something else with it, right? Or is it the promotion of learning? And we'll have to obviously define what learning is. So I'll just take a few stabs at it. What is learning? Is it gaining knowledge? Is it developing a new skill? Or as Dr. Kornfeld talked about last week, is this idea of knowing, right? You learn something, and so then you act, and as a result, you care about something. The reason why there are question marks behind each of these is we still don't know what teaching and learning is. We're still trying to figure that out, and that's why it's so complex as we think about our profession as teachers and you as learners, and whatever that relationship might be, perhaps as opposed to other disciplines or other fields of study, right? Wanting on the right-hand side to make connections to what Dr. Kornfeld talked about last time, right? Transmission, there's a very famous theoretician in education, Paulo Freire, talks about it as a banking education, right? The transmission is we are holders of knowledge and you are empty vessels, and we're sort of just doing a core dump of our knowledge into you as passive recipients in the educational process. In that model, teachers, educators are active. We're the one that's doing all the and you're sitting there passively absorbing the wonderful knowledge we have. So again, a very common way, unfortunately, you can tell where my bias lies as we think about how we get to this idea of teaching and learning. How do we get you to learn different things? As opposed to transaction, which is what Dr. Kornfeld talked about. Within the School of Education, we're firm believers in the idea of constructivism. Constructivism. The idea that people generate knowledge and meaning from interaction between their experiences and their ideas. right? So the educator-student relationship is social, active, and reflective. Two very different ways that we approach teaching and learning in higher education. As I mentioned in my section, in your experience here at SSU, you will see and experience all of these different ways that we approach teaching and learning. And again, it is very, very complex. And again, part of the trouble is it's driven by many different factors, right? Disciplinary styles. People who teach math have a way that they think math should be taught. Economics, certainly the idea of having all of you and one faculty member teaching is more cost effective than having 10 teachers with smaller sections or seminar. There are economics and politics involved in thinking about teaching and learning in higher education. Certainly standards, the idea of meeting a certain standard or way of learning drives what we do as we think about teaching and learning. Also, we have to recognize that there are personal and professional preferences for teachers. All of us, myself included, have a preferred way that I like to approach teaching and learning. So again, you're not going to get the same thing as you move through your educational experience. Again, I just want for you to take a moment and think about your fall schedule and the ways that we're asking you to engage in teaching and learning here at the university, right? Here is a beginning list of some of the ways that perhaps over your 4 years, you will be exposed to the way that we approach teaching and learning. Lecture, seminar, lab, fieldworks, field trips, internships, practicums, of course, online teaching, independent study, co-curricular. And within those ways that we approach teaching and learning, we ask you to do many things. Again, with the goal of thinking about how we teach and how you learn, right? We ask you to read and write, observe, post, blog, talk, dance, research, create, question, discuss, present, critique, sing, listen, play, practice instruments, paint, sculpt, experiment, videotape, work independently, work collaboratively. It goes on and on and on. Again, I just want for you with this slide here just to recognize how complex it is as we think about what teaching and learning is in higher education. Okay, so now let's jump a little bit deeper into the rabbit hole. What I want to do now is share with you how teachers prepare for teaching, right? So if you were to open up my brain and take a look, like what does he go through as he thinks about preparing for a lesson or a class or whatever is happening? This is a basic diagram that we use when we talk about teaching to teachers. There are differences of opinion about where you start and all of that, but I'm sharing with you how I approach teaching and learning, right? Typically start with clarifying what are our lesson goals or objectives. What do I want for you to be able to do after this experience? Then we move to, perhaps, what are the tools that I have? What are the curriculums and materials that I'll have to be able to get to that goal or idea of getting you to learn something, right? Then I think about my teaching methods. How am I going to approach it? And ultimately, some kind of assessment, some kind of way that I'm testing to make sure that you did learn ultimately what my lesson goals are. A big part of what we do in terms of thinking about teaching and learning is this idea of reflection. Continually checking back to make sure that we're making progress as we hope to be making progress. So let me give you an example. Let's just say, for fun, that this fall, my department says we really, really need for you to teach this new course we have at Sonoma State University, and it's called Papyrus, the Principles of Papyrus Propulsion. What do you think that means? The Principles of Papyrus Propulsion. I'll fill it in for you. Building a paper airplane. Learning to build and fly a paper airplane. Wouldn't that be a cool class to teach, right? I had 10 students in my class, and right, this idea that one of the important outcomes of the university is to teach you how to be able to think and prepare or ultimately build a paper airplane. So using this model here, how do I start, right? I start by defining what my lesson outcomes are, what my goals are. And in this case here, I'd like my students to be able to build and fly a paper airplane, right? That's my lesson goals. That's what I'm hoping you will achieve at the end of our experience together. So what will I need? Obviously, I'll need paper, a ruler, maybe a table. What else do you think I'll need in order to teach you how to build a paper airplane? This is where I hear from you. What else do you need? Students. Oh, absolutely. I mean, students, yeah, that'd be kind of weird if it was just me teaching myself. So absolutely we need students. Anything else? Any other curriculum materials that I'll need? Maybe not. Maybe that's sufficient. Right? So then I think about, so how am I going to get them to do this thing called building a paper airplane, right? I have my ideas, I have my materials, right? So maybe one of the ways that I'll approach this is I'll explain how to build one, and then they will build them on their own, right? That's one way, perhaps, that a professor who's teaching this class can get people to learn to build paper airplanes. Ultimately, we end up with assessment, and so the final exam of the class here is, I have all of my 10 students lined up, and we launch paper airplanes. That could be a very simple way to do that. Let's just say, in this example here, with my 10 students, right, 6 of them launched the paper airplane, and they flew as I imagine paper airplanes should fly. But of the 6, 4 kind of threw them, and they fell right to the ground. Here's where I want for us to begin thinking about the roles of the teacher and the student in the educational process. Who's to blame? Who's to blame if my 10 students, 6 are able to do it and 4 could not? Is it the student's fault, or is it my fault as a teacher? Those are one of the critical reflection questions I want for you to begin thinking about, because that's what we struggle with in higher education. And again, that will lead to, in a few minutes here, talking about your learning as opposed to our teaching. As you think about this, what model of education do you think this captures? Transmission or transaction? Don't be shy, come on. Somebody? Anyone? Bueller? Transmission? Transaction? Transmission, why? Nice and loud.
It's going from the teacher to the student.
Right, it's going from the teacher to the student. If we go back a couple of slides and ask you to think about the principles, right? How do we do this thing called transmission education versus transaction? This is very one-dimensional, right? I tell you, you go do, right? So that is one way to characterize it. So because I'm a reflective educator, I think 6 out of 10, not so good. I need to change my teaching so that I can have more students be successful in this class of learning to build paper airplanes, right? So what do? Right? The first thing is begin by looking at what were my lesson goals or objectives, right? So maybe I need to clarify that I'd like my students to be able to, here we have a difference. Did I want for them to duplicate a paper airplane that I thought it should look like, or did I want for them to create their own? That wasn't clear in my initial lesson planning. So part of what we do as effective educators is go back and rethink about what was the point and purpose of the lesson? Like, why did we do this? Why did we have this time together? So maybe in this case here, I want for them to duplicate what I think a paper airplane should look like. So we're not going to have them create their own. I'm clarifying that. And because, again, 6 out of my 10, the paper airplane landed there, I want to actually have a little bit clearer guidance for my students about what flying means, right? And so perhaps as I'm thinking about it, then I really do want for them, as they're thinking about it, to be able to fly 20 feet as I get them to think about teaching and learning. That didn't fly 20 feet. I'd actually failed my class. So I clarify my lesson objectives. Didn't I? Clarify my lesson objectives, then go to thinking about what I'll need now under this new lesson. I'll need paper still. I'll need a ruler. Now I'll need a tape measure because we're actually going to measure this idea of 20 feet. So, okay, he has a clearer sense of what he's hoping we'll achieve. Maybe I'll actually give some readings on aerodynamics. I really want for them to think through this idea of copying an example of a paper airplane that I have, developing it, and really showing an understanding of the principles behind Paris propulsion, throwing a paper airplane. So then I think about my teaching methods. I'll explain the principles of flight, maybe have them do some readings, maybe I'll have them build some samples, right? Before we get to the final exam, try it out first. Try it out first. And then test it, rebuild it, maybe have them work collaboratively, maybe have seminar discussions about good ways to take a paper airplane that I think is what a paper airplane should look like, and talk about principles of aerodynamics or whatever. And then obviously going to have the final exam. This time I'll have them toss it and measure to make sure that they got it to the 20 feet. So remember my class of 10? Well, this is a new class now. I now have 10 more students. and I line them up and I get them to do it. And so I have the students, right? 6 of them build a paper airplane as I think it should be built. It flies the 20 feet. Then out of my remaining 4, I have 2 students who say, Dr. Ayala, I want to take you up to Stevenson Hall and go to the 2nd floor. And what they do is they crumple up a piece of paper and they drop it from the 2nd floor down to the 1st floor. And they say, I passed the class because it flew 20 feet. Creative, didn't look like a paper airplane. Again, you could see that the importance of how well we're able to think about giving clear directions about what we think, how learning should occur, is going to drive your learning. So one of the things is, in order for you to be an effective student, I have to be an effective teacher and make very clear how it is I think we should do this dance called teaching and learning. So I go through the process again, and I rethink of my goals, and I rethink of the materials, and I rethink of how I'm going to approach it. I get it again. Years of teaching this class, I become the expert on building paper airplanes, right? And time again, I have, let's say on average, 8 out of the 10 students successfully throw a paper airplane and have it fly 20 feet. 8 out of the 10 times. So, what if all of our students don't succeed? Now we're diving in a little bit deeper into the rabbit hole and starting to talk about your learning. I've talked about my teaching. Let's talk about your learning. So if all of my students don't succeed, again, who's to blame? Do we blame you for being a student who can't learn the way that I teach? Or again, should I be continuing to be reflective and thoughtful about how I approach teaching and learning so that I can get up to 100%. That's one of the things for my colleagues here who are teachers that we struggle with, I think, in higher education is really what is the point and purpose of the work that we do? Is it to weed out the unqualified and set high bars in exams about how students should succeed, and if they don't meet it, then they did not qualify in our mind, and we weed them out from what higher education is? Or is our job and function and role in a teaching institution like CSU is to continue to work on our teaching until we get 100% success? We have to ask ourselves as educators, as faculty, and if all of you are going to become future teachers, that central idea. What is your role as a teacher, and what is your role as a student? But back to my students, back to the 2 that didn't do well, right? We know, all educators at all levels recognize that students do not all respond equally well to the same instructional methods, right? Individuals, you also report experiencing preferences for one learning style over another. I have these references and I can give them to you. Researchers have examined learning styles for years, yet the validity, we'll talk about validity here in a minute, of learning styles has received mixed reaction from the research community. Again, the citation there for that. There's also quite a bit of uncertainty as we're talking about learning styles, like what are we talking about? Are we talking about learning styles inventory like VART, which I hope all of you had a chance to do, because again, we're going to have an activity here in a minute on that. There are others called learning styles inventories. There are many different learning style inventories out there. Or, if we're talking about this idea of learning styles, are we actually measuring personality traits? What's the overlap between the 2? Myers-Briggs, MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. These are tools that you can take to learn more about yourself. Or are we talking about some form of intelligence? You might have heard the term Gardner's multiple intelligences, right? This idea that we have different ways that we approach understanding our world. Wechsler is a very famous intelligence exam that we still continue to give in K-12 schools. Kaufman talks about crystallized versus fluid forms of intelligence. Feuerstein talks about dynamic assessment, different ways that we think and capture what intelligence is. So each of these is like its own thing in and of itself. So there is no clear understanding, really, what we're talking about when we think about this idea of learning styles inventory. And again, since we're talking about you as a learner, what are the other factors that play a part about how well you do as a student, right? Certainly we know that motivation is going to be one factor, right? Do you want to learn it? Do you want to learn how to build a paper airplane? If you're motivated, it's going to be easier. If you're not motivated, probably that's going to be a factor. about whether you're the two in my class that couldn't quite get building a paper airplane despite my awesome instruction of it, right? Time of day, morning, afternoon, when do you learn best? All of those things, age, gender, health status. There are many individual factors about you that will impact to what extent you're going to do well in my class. And again, I go back to that central question. I did everything I think I could to prepare you to build a paper airplane and launch it 20 feet. So at some point, are not you held responsible and accountable for that idea of success? Again, one of those tricky touch points that we have in higher education and thinking about teaching and learning. So let's talk a little bit about VARC, and specifically, hopefully all of you had a chance to do the learning styles inventory. Socrates described the basic human impetus to know thyself, a fundamental drive to explore and understand ourselves. My question is, can a quiz shed some light on what we could possibly want to know? So, with a show of hands, don't be shy if you did not, but raise your hand, just give me a sense, if you did do VARC. Look around, just to get a sense. You did do VARC. Okay, so at least half. You did you? Yes, yes, yes. We want 100%. Oh, I failed as a teacher, right? Because not everyone, I gave the directions. I assume your faculty said you need to do this before class. Is that me as a teacher or is that you as a learner? That's what we wrestle with. That's what we wrestle with in higher education. Barring the fact that all of you did not, will move forward, right? Here's my VARC. The key with VARC is answering as honestly as possible. Honestly. It's answering as honestly as possible. So my own learning preference is visual, 8, that was one of the highest, oral, 4, read, write, and that's why I put on my piece of paper. How embarrassing. Here I am in higher education. This is not my learning preference. I actually don't do well, quote unquote, if I have to read or write about something. I'm a great reader and I'm a great writer. But if it's a preference, I'd rather have another way that I approach learning about different things. If we believe in the concept of learning preferences as a big part of how we learn, or rather, how you learn what you do. And then, of course, you talk about multimodal. It doesn't mean that you're one category or the other. We'll get into a minute about reliability and validity in terms of VARC, but just with a show of hands now, how many of you, raise your hand, if your top score was visual? Look around. Hold that up and look around. Okay. How many of you, hands down, how many of you was your top score oral, meaning learning by listening? Look around. Look around. How many of you are akin to, have a preference for read and write as your top score? Look around. Look around. How many of you were kinesthetic learners, right? I'll put myself in that bunch. Again, it doesn't mean that you can't and don't have preferences. I'm very multimodal, I'm visual, and very, let's do it. That's the way I figure it out. So, keeping that in mind, let's go through what was your lowest score. How many of you had the lowest score in visual? Raise your hand. Look around, just get a sense. How many of you had the lowest score in R? How many had the lowest score in read-write? Yeah, I put myself there. How many of you had kinesthetic as your lowest score? One person. Okay. So what? So what? How important is that information to me as your teacher? So what? We're going to get into the so what here in a minute. So let me just talk a little bit about reliability and validity. These are very general terms. They get much more complex as you move into thinking about psychometrics. But reliability is the idea of, are we measuring the same thing, whatever we're measuring, time and time again in a similar fashion. Validity is, are we measuring what we purport to measure, what we say we're measuring. Let's just take a look at two of the prompts from the VARC. You're going to cook something as a special treat. You would cook something you would know without the need for instructions, or use a good recipe, or ask friends for suggestions, or look on the internet or in some cookbooks for ideas from pictures. Is that measuring learning? Does it look like it? Raise your hand if you believe it does. couple people. How about this one here? A website has a video showing how to make a special graph. There was a person speaking some lists and words describing what to do in some diagrams. You would learn most from reading the words, watching the action, seeing the diagrams, or listening. Is that measuring learning styles or learning preferences? Raise your hand if you believe so. Okay. So again, part of what we see here is whether or not we think there's face validity. We call it face validity. Does it look like, does it smell like, does it taste like a learning styles inventory? Quite a bit of folks have done research on these, and again, it's a whole field of study. It's a whole thing in and of itself when you begin to explore and examine the idea of whether or not these things are real or not. Okay, so let's get back to that question I said in terms of so what? I asked you what your learning preferences is, so what? Is that important for me to know and understand as a teacher? That's what we're talking about when we talk about the impact of teaching and learning as being linked together in some fashion. So here's where we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the rabbit hole and think about this idea of learning preferences and learning realities. And what I tend to talk about when I'm working with other educators is, who do we design our teaching for? And do we have a clear understanding of who our student body is? I gave you a test. I understand your learning styles preferences. So what? So what? Right? We have this idea of a normal person, whatever normal is. And I will put normal in quotes because we could certainly have that discussion as well. But there is this belief that all of you are capable of learning however it is that I'm going to teach. With a few exceptions. With a few exceptions. We know that a person perhaps who's acquiring English as a second language or has languages other than English, the way I approach teaching, I'm making assumptions that you understand the English language. If you are a person still acquiring English as a second language, the way that I'm teaching probably is not going to work as well for you. Maybe not as well for you as other people. But I know that, right? I think about that, and that's kind of pretty obvious. We certainly have people in our community who are individuals with disabilities. These are very real things, right? Things that will impact how they can interact with their world. So obviously, if I'm setting up a lesson, maybe doing something with regard to, throwing paper airplanes, and I had a student with no arms, could happen. How am I going to approach teaching and learning, recognizing that they're not going to be able to have this thing and do this thing called propulsion? That's going to be obvious for me. I'm going to see it, and I'm going to have to figure it out. How am I going to address that? Then we have people with temporary restrictions, perhaps sports injuries, right? They have a twisted wrist or something like that. And so that's going to play a part in terms of thinking about how I approach teaching and learning and those very real realities that we face as educators. But let's peek behind the door of the normal person and begin to think about that concept of learning style and learning preference, right? Because some would argue that a normal person, we're all normal people, whatever that means, do have this learning preference. And to what extent, and we'll get to this in a minute, to what extent should that drive what we think about in terms of how we prepare for our teaching in higher education? So it's hard to see, but I'll read it to you. I'm a visual learner. Shush. I learn by listening. You think so loud. I love to read. I learn by doing. This is VARK, right? Again, to what extent should I also take into account your learning style or preference when I'm preparing you to throw paper airplanes? Okay, so let's take that idea and apply it to teaching and learning, right? So where do we draw the line between preference and learning reality? Where do we draw the line between preference and learning reality? Okay, so let's just say that if I'm asking somebody to do something, if it comes relatively easy for them, I probably would think that they are a typical or normal learner, right? I can learn in most ways. On this continuum of it's easier for me to learn and it's more difficult for me to learn, right? I would put this idea of learning style or preference. This is easy. Yeah, no matter what you do, I'll figure out how to build a paper airplane. I can see, I can hear, I can interact, whatever. This is not a challenge for me to learn what you're asking me to learn. But then we get into learning style or preference. Learning style or preference. I assessed all of you, and some of you have strengths visual, auditory, read, write, kinesthetic, and also the negatives, the challenges. It's more difficult for me, right? I learn best by listening, but not so much when I have to read about it. I am very much that person in this area here. And then, of course, we have people with very real disabilities who, let's just say that they have low vision or are blind, and they would say, I'm not able to use sight to learn. So given this continuum here, here are the people that intrigue me the most in my field, right? The people that fall on this continuum in some fashion. So let me break it apart and have you think about it, right? So if it's easier for you to learn, right, I'm probably going to find great success. I will get 10 out of 10 as a learner, right? If it's a learning preference, it's probably not going to keep you from learning. Probably not going to keep you. So even though it's not what you prefer, you'd still figure it out and be able to fly the paper airplane. But at what point on this continuum does a learning preference serve as a barrier to your success, to your learning, right? And then at some point, obviously, if it's a person with an obvious physical disability, I'm going to be aware of that. I'm also concerned about people with what we call hidden disabilities. The disabilities are not obvious to you and me. Learning disabilities, ADHD, those things that are very real disabilities, but it's not obvious that they're blind or whatever their particular disability is. These are the people, again, that intrigue me the most. And is there a tipping point between a preference and ultimately a need? When do I need to think about that as a teacher? Again, if it's easier for you to learn, you're going to learn, right? And probably it's not what you prefer, but you're going to do it. But at what point does that idea, rather, let me just put it this way. At what point is your, on that negative side, when you said, I struggle with learning how to do the read and write, look at me, I got a 0 on read and write. I got a 0 on read and write, because I answered it honestly. It's not my way to prefer it. Is that going to stop me from learning, and so I am the one who's responsible, or is the responsibility for the teacher to continue to think about ways to approach teaching and learning so all my students can be successful? That's a perennial question that we ask ourselves. Again, is there a tipping point between preference and need? So, if we believe in learning preferences, right, should we teach to the individual learning style or preference? Let me read the cartoon. So here's the student and here's the teacher. As we start a new school year, Mr. Smith, I just want you to know that I'm an abstract sequential learner and trust that you'll conduct yourself accordingly. So here's a person who believes very firmly that their learning preference is probably a need, and so the teacher should modify how they approach teaching and learning so the student can be successful. In the teacher's mind, they're thinking, how real is this thing called learning preference or learning style? What is she trying to feed me here? All of those things, perhaps, are going on in this professor's mind. Or maybe they're open-minded and do believe in learning styles and learning preferences. One end of the continuum or the other, or. Should we expect that regardless of learning preference, that students adapt to the way that we teach? So in this cartoon here, right, you have a professor, teacher, whoever, and you have a crow and a monkey and a penguin and an elephant and a fish and maybe a sea lion and a dog. And he says, for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please go climb that tree. Right? So, should we expect that regardless of what you raised your hand, here's what's going to happen in my class on tossing paper airplanes. If you don't do it, you're the one who's responsible. As opposed to, should we be thinking about the other end of the continuum where you are the learner that you are, and we should be continually adapting and thinking about how we approach teaching and learning. I think reality is probably somewhere in the middle here. Probably somewhere in the middle. But again, that's why, as we think about teaching and learning in higher education, it is so complex. We struggle with these questions. I hope we struggle with these questions as we think about, if 8 out of 10 of my students was successful, is that an issue of me as a teacher, or is that an issue of you as a student? Where did the breakdown occur? I'm going to leave you with a concept here that I have been thinking about for about 7 to 8 years as we think about teaching and learning. And the concept is universal design for learning. And it does come from a little bit of what I talked about here before, exploring the idea of learning preferences, learning realities, learning disabilities, and how we should be thinking about approaching teaching and learning. The simplest way that I can capture this, and we certainly can continue this conversation at the round table. So here's the image here, and I'll sort of walk you through it. So the image is, there is a teacher or a custodian or somebody who's, obviously trying to navigate shoveling some snow here, and you have a student who appears to be in a wheelchair say, could you please shovel the ramp? And there's a ramp that goes up to the classroom door here. And the teacher, janitor, whomever says, all these kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you. And the student says, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. We can all get in. So the caption here, clearing a path for people with special needs, clears a path for everyone. So what I talk about when I speak about universal design for learning is barriers that we put into place in our teaching. Stairs are barriers for some people, not just people in wheelchairs, but perhaps people who use a skateboard, roll a bike, have media carts that they're pushing, baby strollers, all of those things that are wheel-based. Stairs are barriers. But we've been building stairs the same way for centuries. But we don't really recognize that they're not well designed for everyone. So why not think about rebuilding our physical environment by putting in ramps? That way, those that are able-bodied, whatever that is, can use the path. Those that are wheelchairs, those that have bikes, baby strollers, whatever, can all access it the same way. We take that concept of built physical environment, right? How we design chairs, all of that you are sitting in and you will see here at Sonoma State University, and apply it to teaching and learning. And I would ask those of you who are teachers, or if you're going to be future teachers, to think about that idea of putting in barriers to learning. Putting in barriers to learning. The classic one is the textbook. We all use them, right? But it's this archaic thing where it's bound and there's print and white paper and black ink. We actually don't stop and think that a printed textbook might be a barrier for somebody. And so as an educator, thinking about this concept of universal design for learning, can we stop and think about how else I can get that information and make it a ramp and not stairs for you as you approach your educational journey? This whole thing, UDL, has been a big part of my professional career for about 6 or 7 years. That's what Scott was alluding to in my work at a national level and thinking about how we approach teaching and learning. So we're about out of time. I can sense the restlessness in the room, so I will leave you with these reflection questions. These are things that I hope will continue in our, hang on, not done yet. Do we all learn the same way? Do we all learn the same way? Can we all learn the same way? Can we all learn the same way? Should we frame how we teach in relation to how people learn? And again, hopefully, as we explore critical thinking, what assumptions are embedded in these questions? I invite you to join me at 4 o'clock, where perhaps we continue these conversations and address your questions.